and welcome to the channel. So I've made another concept. This time it's not a sports model, it's something different. Also, it's a watch designed entirely from scratch. And I believe if Tudor considered a watch like this as part of their collection, it could be a crowning addition to their Black Bay range. Let's begin. So a while ago, I designed the Tudor Black Bay Traveller, a concept which was a slightly modified Black Bay Pro, aiming to be slimmer with a more accessible dual time feature. Tudor's a great brand with some incredible watches and a lot of amazing releases lately. But what struck me most is how much I wouldn't consider the other watches in their range. As a collector, you could look at Rolex and be interested in a number of the sports watches in their range. You would also consider their so-called classic watches from the Day Date, the Datejust, and the Rolex Oyster Perpetual. I would even extend that interest to their Cellini collection and have one or two Cellinis in my collection. And this could be their older Cellini models or the current Cellini moon phase. You could also say the same for Breguet, Vacheron, Patek, Seiko, Longines or Omega. They have sports models which are great and really fine classic models. The takeaway here is they all have a balance of watches you would consider across their collection. The same just isn't true for Tudor. When I think of Tudor, I only think of their sports models. And when I looked at their website, I completely forgot their extensive range of classic watches. This imbalance is something I think Tudor should spend some time on. Of course, they should continue releasing great sports models. But wouldn't it be great to consider classic watches from Tudor? They have so many sub-brands and so many collections. The Glamour Date, the Glamour Day Date, the Glamour Double Date, the 1926, and loads more. The first thing I would do from a business standpoint is consolidate the collection and also reduce the amount of variations they have in each of their sub-brand collections. After that, I would introduce two new models, and today I want to focus on one of the models. The first model is something I've been thinking about since looking back at Tudor's history. Tudor is very much its own brand, which does borrow from its bigger sibling. I've discussed Tudor's different eras in a previous video, but their most loved eras are the ones where they have borrowed from Rolex and added their own twist. And this informed how I actually designed this concept watch. And when designing this watch, I stuck to 4 principles. The first was I had to borrow from Rolex's past. The second, it couldn't be a sports watch, it had to be a classic watch, something smart and a little dressy. The third principle was to reintroduce the Prince name into Tudor, which I'll talk about later. And the fourth principle was to show Tudor's spirit in some way. Tudor is not a restrained brand like Rolex, so I wanted to make sure it was important that the watch could cut loose in some way and be different. That's something that is very much Tudor. Look at their P01, the ceramic models from Tudor, the North flag, and if you want to go that far back, the 90s for a range of very different and spirited watch designs. And here's the first iteration, the Tudor Prince Heritage 35. I really enjoyed designing a classic watch from scratch. And actually, I couldn't stop and designed a second version. As you can see, this is a watch inspired by early era Rolex watches from 1935. I looked at a lot of watches in Rolex past and I couldn't help but notice the cushion cases from that era. Now there are other brands that have popularized the cushion case in their watches, but the cushion case was very much part of Rolex's early history, and it's only right that Tudor's able to borrow from that history with Tudor's modern take on those old Rolex references. They've done it with the Tudor Black Bay 58 based on the Tudor Submariner, which is based on the Submariner. And also more recently, the Black Bay Pro being based on the Rolex 1655 reference. So here are the details. A 40mm case size in steel. Of course, this comes on a leather strap, and I went for a master chronometer certified movement because why not? I added a small seconds because frankly that's my favorite function on a watch, and a lot of those historical references had small seconds on the dial. I then added a sector dial, which I thought was a bit of fun, and again this was popular in a lot of the references I looked at. But this was also an important touch because Tudor doesn't have any watches with sector dials in their current collection. So I thought this would be a good way to bring that into their collection today. I also wanted to introduce the Prince name back into Tudor watches. When you look at a lot of Tudor watches from the past, you'll see Prince written on the watch face. This name could be a good sub-brand alternative to the Black Bay. If the Tudor Black Bay represents Tudor's sports models, maybe the Tudor Prince could represent Tudor's classic watches. And the Heritage 35 part of the name is obviously because it's a reference from a 1935 model. You're probably wondering why I call this the Spirit of the Black Bay. That nickname has come from the fact that when I created this variation, I wanted to bring a bit of the Black Bay spirit into the watch using the indices from the Black Bay to make this classic watch just a little bit more familiar and not too sober. When you sit this watch against Tudor's other classic watches, you start to see the possibilities of how Tudor could bring balance to their collection and not be so reliant on the Black Bay sub-brand. So over to you, Tudor. Will you stick with your current classic watches, or will you develop a modern take from your watch heritage? And if so, would you consider the Heritage 35?